on this computer. Okay, so we're recording, so I'm going to get this evening's lecture started. Thank you to everyone for joining us this evening for the next lecture in our 2020-2021 lecture series. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm the Nova Scotia Arc Society President, Sarah Ingram. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Just for those who missed the announcement earlier, this lecture is being recorded in order to share with the membership who could not make it. So just be aware that we are recording the lecture. I've got a couple of announcements before I introduce tonight's lecture, which is entitled Aesthetics or Function, the Influence of Color Preference in Lithic Preparation on the Maritime Peninsula. Okay, so first and foremost, next month is our annual general meeting and election. So we are open to have nominations for the 4 executive positions as well as the 6 members at large. If you're interested in running, please email your bio and which position you'd like to run for to nsarchaeology@gmail.com. Just as a reminder, you do not need to be a professional archaeologist to run for the NSAS. We would love to have avocationalists, people who are just interested in archaeology, students, everybody. We would love to have you if you're interested in participating and helping us improve and continue with what we do at the NSAS. Please don't hesitate to run. If you have questions about what the positions entail, it was sent out in the last membership email, but if you'd like that information, you can also email us at our Gmail or message us on Facebook and we can share that information with you. At this time, we haven't finalized our lecturer for the AGM next month, but it will follow. There will be a lecture that follows our AGM, which typically is about the first 30 minutes. In order to vote in that AGM or to run, you will need to be a current member. So any memberships that are purchased right now would be for this season. So if you do purchase a membership between now and the end of the season, which is the end of May, it will count for the 2020-2021 year unless otherwise specified. And if you're unsure on your voting status, please feel free to contact us and we can let you know if your dues are up to date or not. We also still have some society mugs available for sale. They're $5. They're 8 ounces or 12 ounces. They're like the small size. They're really cute. We can organize local delivery or local contactless pickup here in Nova Scotia. Shipping is not really an option right at this moment, but it's something if you really need a mug, like please email me and we can figure something out. Excuse me. We do have a tentative walking tour planned for the weekend of May 15th and 16th. If you're interested in attending, if the COVID restrictions are lifted and allow for an event at that time, please email the nsarchaeology@gmail.com and we will add you to the list. But at this moment, our intention, I should probably mention that it is a walking tour of Long Lake and the World War I trenches by our Secretary, Terry DeVoe. If the COVID restrictions have not changed at that time, our intention is to do a Facebook Live tour, which we will advertise and will obviously be available to anyone who wants it because it will be digital and therefore COVID friendly. We're also still looking for sponsorships. If you're interested in sponsoring one of the lectures, please reach out to us. If you have a business or a company that would like to be promoted or help support the NSAS, we're always welcome to that conversation. And lastly, for tonight's lecture, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please either put them in the chat or message them to me privately. And at the end, I'll curate everything and we'll go through the questions together at the end. So tonight I'm honored to introduce tonight's presenters, Ken Holyoke and Susan Blair. Tonight, Ken will be doing the presenting, but Ken and Susan have worked together on this topic and will both be answering questions at the end. So Ken received his MA from the University of New Brunswick in 2012 and has worked in cultural resource management throughout Eastern Canada for over a decade. He's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on lithic technology, quarrying, sourcing and exchange, placemaking, and hunter-gatherer archaeology in the Northeast. He's a founding board member of the APMB and is published on Maritime Peninsula pre-contact history and lithic technology in the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, and the Canadian Museum of History's Mercury series. Susan Blair is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of New Brunswick, engaged in a range of research projects that focus on pre-contact technology, including copperworking and stone tool, pottery, and textile manufacturing. She's also engaged in exploring the processes involved in community-driven research and Indigenous archaeology. She currently holds a Shirk Insight Grant exploring Indigenous settlement patterning on the Fundy Coast of New Brunswick, and is a co-grantee for a National Geographic Society grant relating to a pre-contact Indigenous fisheries in the Bay of Fundy. Dr. Blair is a co-founding member and past president of the AAPMB. So if you could all digitally welcome our presenters, I'm going to switch over hosting to you. Oh my goodness, where did you go? There you go. Thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Nova Scotia Archaeology Society, for inviting me to talk, and for both Sue and I. It's exciting to talk to you all this evening. I'm going to share my screen here. Just a sec, change the thing. Okay. Okay, so I'm hoping everybody can see that. Sue, I can see you, so can you thumbs up if it's showing? Yeah, great. Okay, so the title of the talk tonight is Aesthetics or Function, the Influence of Color Preference in Lithic Preparation on the Maritime Peninsula, co-written by Sue and I. It's based around a paper that we recently put out in JAA that Sue and I and Cliff Shaw at the University of New Brunswick Earth Sciences Department had been working on, well, for the better part of a decade, I think, would be probably a fair way to put it. It includes some of Sue's own research from her dissertation, and has been sort of the product of conversations we've had over a number of years, thinking about what sort of reasons beyond economics might be driving the ways that pre-contact groups were accessing and using different types of stone material. So I want to begin by acknowledging a whole cast of people and groups and funding agencies that have contributed to my research, to Sue's research, and some of my research, recent PhD fieldwork and that sort of thing, and the many institutions and people that have helped me out with this and give me ideas and read through things and provided information, places to stay, and museums and places to park and look through a microscope. I'd also like to acknowledge that this presentation is primarily focused on research and data from the Canadian Maritime Provinces, areas which lie within unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Wabanaki people, most specifically the territories of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Pescomacadiac nations. And these territories are covered by treaties signed with the British Crown in 1725, so this is treaties of peace and friendship, and recognize Indigenous title to those lands. I'm also coming to you from Toronto tonight, so I'd like to acknowledge the lands from which I'm coming to you virtually. And so for thousands of years, the areas where I live currently have been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. And today, this is still the place, meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. So in the opening of our recent paper, Sue and I make the statement that deciphering hunter-gatherer aesthetic and cultural preference in the archaeological record is complicated. While the statement was meant to think globally about our research, it was also focused on answering questions locally about the types of patterns we have seen in the procurement, preparation, and exchange of lithic materials in archaeological assemblages on the Maritime Peninsula. So to answer the questions about patterning, so for example, that there appears to be evidence for changing preferences in the quality and appearance of stone over time on the Maritime Peninsula, from duller, coarser stone, usually of local origin, to waxy or glassy, fine-grained, and often exotic materials like you see on this slide. Or that there appears to be a preference for red variants of chert for making unifacial scrapers. You can see here Washtenaw chert from New Brunswick, Munsungan chert from northern Maine, and Minas Basin material from the Minas Basin, Nova Scotia, all used to make different types of unifacial scrapers, all dating to the lake woodland. Or that there appears to be, we can draw on abundant literature on optimization, strategy, and constraint in lithic technology, and their role in the organization of technology. This literature would suggest that tool making and tool makers create tools in mindful, strategic ways, carefully weighing the myriad of choices that have to be made in the process of creating them. In the case of lithic tools, for example, this involves choosing raw materials, reducing and shaping them into particular kinds of forms, and working edges and tips, using them, reshaping them, and reusing them again, and so on. The focus on optimality implies that strategic creators of material culture will systematically consider and weigh creative options, and that given this, on average, the tools and tool-making process, as interpreted through the debris resulting from it, will reflect the most optimal solution at any given moment. Certainly, the selection of different types of toolstone made by ancestral Wabanaki groups, that includes the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, was likely informed to a degree by the accessibility, quality, and abundance of stone. So that optimal, those sort of good qualities that we're talking about. Despite this, though, in both of our experiences, this repeated patterning, so preferences for specific colors or shades of specific materials, alongside the ethnographic information, which suggests that that groups were selecting for beyond just technological reasons. Also observations made by descendant community members point to decisions being made that are not rooted in optimal behavior. Sue and I have come at this question from similar angles throughout our research and in various different projects, some of which we've published, presented on at conferences, and much of which remains in many conversations over the last 10 years between us and with friends and colleagues. Ultimately, the strongest evidence we've found for correlations of color with archaeological phenomena, in our experience, centers on the case studies we've seen in the ways that pre-European groups on the Maritime Peninsula have sought out, exchanged, and prepared or modified stone. So today, we'll present two specific cases, one demonstrating changing preferences for specific groups of colors through time, and another which demonstrates that what we interpret to be intentional acts aimed at producing different shades of color through heat treating. Both case studies involve sites in the lower St. John River region and focus on the human modification of stone archaeologists refer to as Washtenaw chert. So you see here in the circle is the location of Washtenaw Lake, and in the inset image right here, you can see the two red double-ended arrows indicate the location of the outcrops that we know of. Washtenaw chert outcrops along the shores, the eastern shore of Washtenaw Lake, which is the southernmost of the chain of lakes in the lower St. John River in central New Brunswick. It's outcrops at and around an area called Bellier's Cove. It should be noted, though, that recent work by Black and others and my own field research has indicated that this may not be the only place that you can get what we would call Washtenaw chert, and that was possibly exploited archaeologically. But we won't cover too much of that in tonight's presentation. And you can see on the slide here, these are various different artifacts and outcrops of Washtenaw chert, and a photo of what it looks like at the quarry, so-called quarry itself. So worldwide, the archaeology of color has been a topic that spanned anthropological subfields and partner disciplines from linguistics and semiotics to cognitive psychology. A study by Berlin and Kay in 1969 indicated that cross-culturally, there are 11 basic color terms that occur in repeated frequency, including from simple to complex, white-black, red, green-yellow, blue, brown, and purple, gray, pink, orange. And ultimately conclude that there's an evolutionary basis for these shared categories. So basically, these are colors that are recognized by a number of different groups. Marshall Solins in 1976 drew on the study, the Berlin and Kay study, to argue that it's not necessarily the result of evolutionary outcomes, but social practices which convey meaning upon different colors, and that in effect, colors are in practice semiotic codes. So they're communicating something basically, that they're symbols for something. Indeed, the preponderance of themes of color is something espoused with evidence from across North America. that suggests red, yellow, white, and black, or sometimes blue, are important colors for many groups, including the Wabanaki, and further evidence that there tends to be patterning in the ways that those color groups are sorted. Among them, the cardinal directions. So for example, reds and yellows may favor east and west. Blacks and whites sometimes favor, and sometimes blue, favoring north-south alignments. So sometimes these colors are associated, and you can see these color wheels indicate different things. To further simplify what De Boer is referring to, talking about color grouping, he refers to them as quaternary color sets. So binaries of light and dark, or as we have found, bright and dull, are divided along similar lines. The only exception being sky blue gray as a color, which is often sorted into the lighter or brighter categories. So in this instance, white and yellow would be considered lighter color, brighter and lighter, and black would be obviously a duller or darker color. Some colors are said to bear higher degrees of potency or are highly active, red among the most cited. Ethnographic and ethnohistoric accounts support the view that color, and especially the color red, was important to the first peoples of the region. European manufactured copper vessels were key trade items in the 17th century, for example. These were used in mortuary ceremonies for copper kettle burials. Like many other indigenous groups in the Americas, the Wabanaki of the Maritime Peninsula valued the reddish color of copper over the yellow of gold. Hamill, writing on Algonquian ethnography generally, described four basic colors: red, azure or blue-green, white, and black, as ideologically charged and fundamental in the organization of meaning in the Wabanaki worldview. The accumulation of these colors, or at least the material manifestations of colors, so perhaps through trade, you're acquiring these different colors and accumulating them over time, was the equivalent to the accumulation of wealth. So in a society that's not working in a monetary system, these reds maybe were acting as a wealth or value item. A concept of physical, spiritual, and social well-being, and it was traditionally bestowed by revered grandfathers of the underworld. So these were charged objects, both in color, but they had meaning that were tied to ancestral peoples. I have a quote at the top here talking about the importance of colors to Paleo-Indian groups. And so archaeological evidence in this region extends back at least 12,500 years ago. And to demonstrate the changing relationships with colors through time more broadly, beginning in the Paleo-Indian period, groups tended to seek out fine-grained, brightly colored cherts for crafting finely made bifaces and scraping tools, including spurred scrapers. So the dramatic, even magical red color that the heat treatment produced might have loomed larger than technological considerations in the minds of Paleo-Indian knappers. And so Snow here is talking about a Paleo-Indian site in New York State, where a number of the Clovis points were heat treated in such a way that using Pennsylvania jasper. And it was altering the colors from sort of yellowy to reds, and most of the formalized bifaces that were found at the site were red, and Snow, even at that time, 1980, was thinking that this had to have had some kind of importance. Recent evidence from throughout and possibly outside the Maritime Peninsula appears to demonstrate that materials consistent with what we would call washed oak chert and in predominantly reddish hues were being sought out alongside Munsungan chert, the material originating in Nova Scotia. So in this slide, you can see several Paleo-Indian points. On the far left is what appears to be a channel flake from a Paleo-Indian site just outside of Fredericton in New Brunswick. Beside that is a Clovis point from De Bert. That's not on washed oak cherts, material from the Minas Basin. At the bottom of the screen is a fluted point from New York State on a material that appears to be washed oak chert. I haven't seen this in a hand specimen, but it was sent to David Black from a collector in New York State. Beside that is probably a late Paleo-Indian point that's in the George Frederick Clark collection from the St. John River somewhere. Appears to be heat treated, and microscopical analysis seems to suggest it is. It could be washed oak chert, and then there's a small spurred end scraper from the De Bert site that's made on washed oak chert at the bottom right. Throughout the early and middle Archaic, there appears to be a shift away from this reliance on chert, for one, and for brightly colored materials more generally. Jumping ahead several thousand years, The late Archaic is viewed as the culmination of long-standing regional traditions focused on groundstone technology. Flakestone tools, where present, are predominantly various kinds of local fine-grained materials of volcanic origin, such as rhyolites, felsites, and basalts. And bifacial tools are both rare and considerably less elaborate than tools that appear in subsequent millennia and previously in the Paleogene period. The two images on your right are from what is probably a terminal Archaic site called Dead Man's Pool in northern New Brunswick. And they're made on a material called Tobic rhyolite. And this material appears to be, and Sue speculated this, and so has David Black, that the color patterning in Tobic rhyolite is sort of transitional in the sense that it's quite red, but it also has this has banding in it. It's duller, it's a coarser material, and so maybe it's transitional to this sort of shift back to preference for cherts. You can see another image of it here in the middle. So in contrast, early maritime woodland technologies were strongly focused on flakestone technology again. In this period, we see the appearance of materials and tools that are both sourced and affiliated with macro-regional manifestations, including Adena and meadow. So you're seeing tool traditions that are spreading through the broader Northeast. You get materials at the Augustine Mound, for example, that are coming from the central United States. And these are strongly expressed in mortuary contexts. And there's a sharp distinction between goods procured for these contexts, which are often highly ceremonial and exotic in nature, and tools found in habitation contexts, which are often of local materials and forms. In both settings, however, there seems to be a preference, again in a broad qualitative sense, for gray, buff, and beige tools that contain the quality of banding or modeling, with an increase in brightly colored materials toward the latter part of the middle woodland. As we move throughout the maritime woodland toward European contact, we can point to several shifts. First, people begin to emphasize the use of a series of waxy to glassy cherts, especially Minas Basin, Washtenamoic, and Matsungan cherts, all of which are shown on the slides here, for tool production, and especially for the production of small unifacial scrapers. The particular variants of these materials that appear to be preference seem to be for brightly colored variants. And so what you can see here are a number of artifacts from what are predominantly late woodland collections. You can see that there's a shift from these duller colors to much brighter translucents, a lot of reds, and a variety of different cherts. Furthermore, these materials begin to appear at some distance from their shore, more often arriving in finished form than as debris, suggesting their circulation in an exchange system which Leonard has attributed to, that was effectuated by Wabanaki women exchanging different types of stone. This is an image of scrapers from the Melanson site, just in the Gaspereau area and close to the Minas Basin, and shows that at that site, groups were working stone from New Brunswick, from northern Maine, and local material from the Minas Basin as well. But in my look, and what I looked at from that collection, there appears to be a preference for red scrapers, among other things. So our first case study focuses on Sue's research, including an analysis of a series of lithic assemblages from 3 archaeological sites in a small but ecologically rich area in the lower St. John River Valley in traditional Wolastoqiyik territory. These include the Gemsay Crossing site, BKDM 14, the Meadows site, BLDN 26, and the Fulton Island site, BLDN 12. And while these sites are significantly different in terms of their structure, they all have components and domestic features that overlap in age. To create a set of comparable subassemblages, Sue limited her analysis to artifacts found in direct association with functionally defined, spatially and stratigraphically restricted features. These consisted of hearths and living floors, combined in various configurations, ranging from simple to complex, simple being basically just an isolated hearth, and complex being a series of features including hearths, storage pits, arranged in what appeared to be probably a living floor or possibly the interior of like a wigwam, for example. So these were recovered from 25 separate, these dates were recovered from 25 separate features that were assigned to 5 sequential periods spanning the time between 1390 Cal BC to Cal AD 550. So from about 3200 to about 1600 BP. These periods can be related to the 3 subdivisions of the early maritime woodland, periods 1 to 3, the middle maritime woodland, periods 4 and 5, and then a fifth period which overlaps with the earlier part of the late maritime woodland. Unfortunately, there remains no dated late woodland components in the lower St. John River. My master's research was meant to be complementary to this sequence, so I was analyzing late woodland collections from the lower St. John River. But at today, we don't have any, despite having some diagnostic artifacts from the period post-dating period 5, there are no dates that go along with this sequence. Some of the broad patterns of color preference are suggested by materials in these assemblages. Scrapers of brightly colored chert, quartz, and quartzites, including Washtenamock chert, quartz, minus basin chert, Mansungan chert, and medium grain quartzite, outnumbers scrapers of other materials almost 3 to 1. Considering that these raw material classes are represented by only 494 pieces, or 14% of the total sample, this is a fairly notable pattern. Collectively, scrapers of these materials occur in all periods, and in contrast, only 7 of the 81 bifaces in this sample are made of these materials. Interestingly, bifaces of brightly colored chert are only found in periods 1 and 2. The dominance of felsic, mafic, and porphyritic volcanics for biface production does not become established until periods 3, 4, and 5, suggesting that the perceived association between bright cherts and scrapers and dull volcanic or quartzites and bifaces intensifies over time. And again, I'm seeing that in the scraper samples as well. As my own research has demonstrated, this pattern does appear to continue into the late maritime woodland in the lower St. John River, so the sites that I looked at. Accounting for material availability and technical limitations of materials themselves did not resolve the patterning at the site level. However, in the process of weighing the logic of optimality against the hunch of color preference, it occurred to Sue that it may be possible to extricate some of the issues of abundance and nappability by controlling for these in sample selection. So Washtenamock chert outcrops within 25 kilometers of all 3 sites in the lower St. John River sample. In the closely circumscribed source area, it's possible to obtain objective pieces that range in color from red to yellow, to blue-gray, to black-brown. And indeed, we can describe these as color variants and distinguish among them in archaeological specimens. All of these variants occur in the archaeological materials of the lower St. John River. Furthermore, it does appear that all the variants were available at the source in the past, and that there's no relationship between the color variants and nappability. In other words, pre-contact knappers would have been able to select from a raw material from one general area that's a uniform flaking characteristics, but varied in color. It's also reasonable to assume that any significant variations through time in one color variant over another might therefore represent color preference. And indeed, there is an increase in the use of brightly colored red and yellow variants. Sue designated these different raw material categories. And through time over the use of more dull blue-gray and brown-black variants. So basically what you're seeing over time is that there's a greater emphasis on these brightly colored variants of Washtenamock chert itself. Furthermore, the changes in the proportion of red, yellow variants to brown, gray, and black variants over time are statistically significant. So in Sue's research, both technological and feature analysis suggested a shift in settlement between periods 2 and 3, and grouping the material from periods 1 and 2 and the material from periods 3, 4, and 5 produces a larger sample and reinforces the view of these trends. So basically what we're seeing through time and into the late woodland is that there's a continuous trend towards a preference for these brightly colored materials, and in particular for scrapers themselves. So our second case study is from the Millbrook Stream site, which is a small late woodland site, located on a low terrace on the south bank of the Millbrook Stream outside of Cambridge Narrows, New Brunswick. So you can see that on the map inset here. The large star is the location of the Millbrook Stream sites, and then the 2 arrows on your map right here are indicating where the Bellius Cove quarry is. The site is comprised of 2 loci, so with only lithic material recovered in both areas, the vast majority of which was Washtenamock chert at 1, so BKDL6, which is shown here, the end of excavation site sketch basically on the figure on your right, was predominantly Washtenamock chert, and then a small locus about 5 meters away from this, designated BKDL5, was dominated by quartz. During analysis of the site lithics, patterning and color differences was observed among the lithics, which was determined to be the result of heat alteration. A number of flakes, so 168 of them, all of Washtenamock chert, exhibited color, translucency, and luster patterning which were divergent from the naturally occurring range of colors in raw geological specimens, which led me to suspect that they had undergone heat treating. The white, red, pink, or gray colors, spotty white patches, black and very dark patches, and crazing and crackling below the surface of the observed artifacts were characteristic of lithic material which had been subject to heat. And they were consistent with reports of heat-altered Washtenaw chert from other regional sites, including BGDQ-29 or Wallace Cove in the Passamaquoddy Bay area. And the likelihood of these artifacts, the likelihood that these artifacts were heat-treated was heat-altered was further supported by the fact that the vast majority of those artifacts were located in the area feature 1, shown on the figure here on the bottom, interpreted as a small open-air hearth. So you can see the outline, and you can see the density of artifacts that were recovered from the area of the hearth. Following the observation of heat treating, an experiment was designed to compare what appeared to be heat-treated material in archaeological assemblages with experimentally heated geological specimens, and to view both of them under scanning electron microscopic imaging to see what the structural changes were occurring in the rock itself. So while there's been acknowledgement of the ethnographically widespread use of heat treating, comparatively little attention has been paid to the cultural impetus for heat treating lithics, in particular in pre-European North America or the prehistoric world more generally. Despite the temporal and geographic ubiquity of the practice, so you see worldwide that heat treating is used for various things, not just for stone. Most studies that do experimental heat treating will tacitly assume or experimentally prove that heat treating was conducted for the purpose of improving the knappability or predictability of certain types of toolstone materials, so that heat treating stone was going to make it easier to make stone tools out of. The determination that material was heat treated is most commonly reported as the observation of divergent colors, so pinkish hues, occasionally evidence for burning, and contrasting dull and vitreous or greasy and lustrous surfaces. So you can also see the image here showing that that sort of shining surface on this artifact, or this is geological specimen which was knapped after heating, produces this very glassy, vitreous luster. The recovery of suspected heat-altered artifacts from hearths or pits is an obvious but relatively rare example. Equally rare is the observation that only specific classes of artifacts or stages of manufacture were subjected to heat treating. So for example, bifaces. At low temperatures between 250 and 600 degrees Celsius, which is within the temperature range of an open air wood fire, visible color changes related to the presence of trace amounts of iron in nearly all materials occur, even when heated over short periods of time. Our experimental results suggest that heat applied to Washtenaw chert produces similar results. So color changes from duller blue-gray colors to brighter hues of white, red, pink, and with color changes beginning as low as 250 degrees and substantial changes at temperatures over 600 degrees. Material that's been heat treated and subsequently knapped possesses a vitreous or glassy luster, like I said, visible on the bulb of percussion and in negative flake scars. So the presence of contrasting duller lustrous surfaces indicates intentional heat treating as opposed to unintentional heat alteration, as the luster is not a trait that's evident on exterior surfaces, flakes or nodules that were simply exposed to a heat source. So basically, you're not going to see that vitreous luster unless a material was heated and then subsequently knapped. If it's just heated, what you'll see is just those color changes, basically. Material that's been heat treated and subsequently knapped possesses this vitreous or glassy luster. The most widely reported benefit of heat treating is the improved flakeability or knappability, as manifested in the reduction of fracture toughness, step and hinge fracture of flakes, sharper edge production, longer flake removals, ease and precision of fracture, and increased homogeneity of the material. So basically, it's improving the material and turning it into a finer grained rock. You can see here that the heat treating experiments showing the changes that are undergoing in Washtenaw chert. In particular, that while you're heat treating it, it sort of bakes the rock from the outside in. So in this image on the bottom right, you can see that on the flake margin, the material has become very flat and annealed, whereas on the interior, you're still seeing some pore spaces. The image on the top right is showing the different temperatures of heat alteration. And on the top left, it's showing you the difference between archaeological and geological, experimentally heated archaeological and geological unheated and heated specimens. So the difference under SEM, like you can see the structural changes that are going on in the rock itself. Perhaps the least discussed aspect of heat treating specifically related to stone tools is the possibility that not all heat treating was conducted specifically for the purposes of improving the quality of toolstone material. For example, heat treating for bead manufacturing is thought to have produced more pleasing and attractive colors, perhaps of sacred meaning, and increased the value of objects. However, there tends to be a distinctly functional or ecological adaptational bend to understanding human interaction with toolstone in the archaeological past, one which indigenous groups, including the Wabanaki, tend to eschew. The fixation on understanding how past groups were improving the quality of toolstone by heat treating ignores the fact that in cases where heat-altered stone exhibits only the types of changes which occur at lower temperatures, like color changes, that these findings may be significant indications of the importance of visual transformations of the stone and the powerful, sacred, religious, or even magical aesthetic appeal of these changes for certain groups. Accounts of heat treating stone among Wabanaki groups extend well into the period following sustained European contact, which suggests that heating stones was part of ritual practice for various purposes. In many parts of North America, including on the Maritime Peninsula, indigenous people undertook ceremonies including creating steam in lodges, using superheated rocks splashed with water. In taking instruction on participating in sweat lodge ceremonies, we've observed a great deal of attention and care being taken in terms of selection of rocks called grandmother and grandfather rocks, and the Wolastoqiyik word for it, which I won't butcher, is up at the top of the screen. This traditional knowledge is considerable and sophisticated. It is notable that the practice of heat treating and fracturing stone using a water dropping technique was described as being practiced by Mi'kmaq groups on the Maritime Peninsula into the 19th century. And archaeological evidence for the practice of sweat lodge ceremonies extended to the maritime woodland. And the images on the slide here show a fractured rock from what was an archaeologically excavated sweat lodge in the south shore of Nova Scotia, down in the Port Jolly area. And then on the right is a Tapanadi's recreation of an indigenous sweat lodge. So we can assume that from this that considerable technical knowledge around the heating of rocks existed in Wabanaki knappers outside of the context of heating toolstone. That heating stone appears to be embedded in socially and ideologically charged rituals is not surprising. The practice of heat treating stone would be time intensive, and great care and knowledge were likely required to manage the time stone was exposed to heat and the temperature to which it was exposed. As Sue's data shows, the changing ways that ancestral Wabanaki groups were procuring and preparing the different colors of washtenaw chert may be indicative of cultural changes and patterned social and symbolic behaviors expressed by groups during the period between 3,200 and 1,600 years ago. So basically, once it was determined that material was likely intentionally heat treated in the experiment that I was doing, we sought to understand whether or not heat treating produced a technological or functional advantage in that the material itself became more knappable. Ultimately, there was no statistically demonstrable improvement in the length of debitage, nor the completeness in heat treated or versus unheated material. Anecdotally, shortly after this paper came out, a flint napper who's joining us in the meeting this evening told me that he has successfully heat treated washtenaw chert, and it does make it easier to work. So so there could be an issue with the what I'm seeing in the archaeological assemblage is just a specific example of this, but I think it still works anyway. But so basically what we determined is that there was no functional benefit to heat treating chert, that it neither improved nor demonstrably degraded the materials. Basically, it was not overheated to the point of destabilizing. Why was it that groups at this site were investing the time to essentially bake rocks for over 12 hours? We estimated that it was about 12 hours of heat treating that was going on there. So the next thing we did was analyzing the stage of manufacture. So we were able to demonstrate that heat treating likely took place at an early stage of manufacture, and that based on the types of tools recovered, bifaces were manufactured out of the heat treated material, one of which was recovered from the site. You can see in the lower left corner here. Experimental results also suggested that heat treating washtenaw chert produces brighter and lighter colors, such as reds, whites, and pinks in raw material that is comparatively dull, so shades of pale brown, dark gray, or blue gray prior to heating. To explore the possibility of this practice at the Millbrook Stream site, tools and debitage from the BKDL6 locus were reclassified using the same color scheme that Sue had used for her assemblage, for her research, sorry. This revealed an interesting pattern, which suggests that despite overall numbers of dull Washtenaw chert artifacts exceeding brightly colored ones through all stages of manufacture, heat-treated Washtenaw chert consistently produced larger proportions of bright colors than were present in the unaltered artifacts. Following this, we revisited the data from the whole site, and at the BKDL5 locus, white quartz, so 249 pieces, and bright red cherts, of which there are 2, predominate, representing a 90.6% of the total assemblage. At BKDL6, white quartz, red and yellow cherts, white quartzite, and brightly colored Washtenaw chert artifacts, 205, represent 35% of the flake lithics at that locus. Considering the entire Millbrook Stream assemblage, which is around 1,300 artifacts, almost half of them are brightly colored, waxy, and/or fine-grained materials. For tools, most particularly formalized scrapers and bifaces, this percentage is even more pronounced. Out of 20 scrapers or scraper fragments, biface fragments and projectile points, 14 or 70% are predominantly red, white, or yellow, and at least 3 of those show evidence of heat treating, which produced a predominantly red ground mass color. These data suggest that perhaps in the absence of raw material from brighter classes, there was a considerable effort made to alter Washtenaw chert to produce desired colors. So the view that color may have influenced technological decisions about the ways that ancestral Wabanaki groups procured, prepared, and exchanged lithic raw material certainly garners support with this sample. In particular, the analysis suggests that knappers may have been interested in brightly colored materials, most preferentially selecting reddish and orange shades. If color preference was a consideration to pre-contact knappers, it may have been that this influenced their decision-making and the lithic production process in several ways. When knappers made decisions about acquiring rock through quarrying, extraction, and collection activities, they may have emphasized particular source areas and quarries and structured their trips and movements around this interest. Furthermore, at the source area, so in the area around a quarry, for example, they may have discriminated during the extraction and collection process, looking for specific types of stone. In the early stages of reduction of multicolored tool stone, for example, a knapper may have purposefully removed portions of nodules with less favored colors, resulting in a bias in the proportion of unwanted colors in debris and preferred colors in finished tools, and especially those that are subsequently circulated and exchanged, either finished tools or preforms. So that's why we might be seeing red scrapers moving outside of the Lower St. John River area. In the broader Northeast, red stone has been preferentially sought out or created through heating, dating back to Paleo-Indian times, a preference possibly linked to its ritual association with blood from a successful hunt. And this is consistent with ethnographic and ethnohistoric accounts of the symbolic meaning attached to color by indigenous groups in the Northeast, including Wabanaki, and for whom material substance, for example stone, was a manifestation of color, not simply a physical property. Indeed, in Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq languages, there is no specific word for color. Thus, the properties of these colors which had ideological import, be it red, white, sky blue, gray, green, or black, were interchangeable with the colored objects themselves. Red stone, red ochre, red copper were all material manifestations of fire, redness, and lightness. For Wabanaki, the social landscape shaped and was shaped by past actions, stories, and relationships with ancestors and kin, be they animate or inanimate, like rock. Stone tools can be thought of as one aspect of the enduring evidence of the building and maintenance of social landscapes, so a relationship between people, place, and things. And the innate animate properties of these colorful things, so these red scrapers and red objects, were maybe activated through the ritual consecration, thereby shaping objects into metaphorical symbols and material manifestations of physical, spiritual, and social well-being. Perhaps transformation of Washtenaw chert through heat treating, or where heat treating was not required, the process of manipulating stone and selecting specific lenses and making specific tools, was a way in which stone objects were made of the material which the way in which stone objects made of the material were consecrated and brought into ritual and social worlds. So merci, thank you, Waliwin, and Wala. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. Oh, okay. I was like, what happened? The screen went. I'm going to reclaim hosting if you don't mind. So thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I honestly, I can never really get enough of images of chert. It's so beautiful. And it's so nice to see the different variations.
We're graced with very pretty chert on the East Coast, actually. That's
yes, yeah. Absolutely. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions that anyone has. Please either send them to me or place them in the chat. And while we wait for anyone's questions, I do have one of my own. So I was wondering, you were talking about the formal tools, specifically like the projectile points and the scrapers that were heat treated. Were you able to tell if they were heat treated prior to completion or after completion, or did you see like a combination of both?
So the biface from Millbrook appears to have been heat treated in probably a larger piece, and then worked down, and then at some point it broke during manufacture, and the small pieces of it, the tip was reheated, and then a piece off of that was actually reheated and flint knapped again into a side scraper. So the image that I showed of that biface that was broken into 3 pieces has been sort of heat treated to create the biface, and then the broken pieces of it were subsequently reheated and reworked into other tools, basically. So they refit from an area sort of around the hearth, basically within about a meter or so of each other, which was good to see because it meant that the site was pretty well intact.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question from Carol. Were similar techniques used by European Stone Age groups?
Yeah, I mean, there's a fairly extensive body of literature on heat treating in the old world. I'm not as familiar with that stuff. Like a lot of the heat treating literature is there's a big body of literature from Australia, but I think it was probably fairly common in like Paleo and Mesolithic, and like, so you know the Neolithic stuff. So I'll let you kind of take that one.
Well, I think one of the things that is a challenge in that literature is there are examples of heat treating. One of the things that makes it difficult to be comparable. It was interesting that one of the very earlier drafts of this research was presented at the SAA a number of years ago in a session where the discussant was Stephen Kuhn, who is a Paleolithic archaeologist and a very sort of traditional, conventional processual type archaeologist, and his one comment was, well, you know, we can't get to that because we can't talk to people. So there's a whole dimension of this that has to do with understanding the role of heat treating, but I think the underlying piece of trying to get at why people were doing that isn't evenly accessible in all places. I think it really does rely on collaboration with Indigenous people to understand those meanings and how those might have been, you know, the pieces that Ken was talking about, the way in which they signify things, that they are used to interact with the spiritual or ceremonial parts of life, or express things in those ways. And so yeah, I think you're right that heat treating is evident in many places. It's the interpretation of it that's the piece that I think is harder to kind of access.
We have another question from Hans. How do you know that a piece or fragments were heated multiple times?
So in the case of that biface, I guess we don't know, but we can interpret based on the degree of color alteration and the visual characteristics. So the lustrous surfaces and things like that. And so the base is clearly heat treated, but not to the degree that the tip is heat treated. And the spall that broke off of the tip fragment has been heat treated to a greater degree because of the color changes that have gone on in that. And it was clearly broken off before the biface was retouched, before the tip was retouched and before it was retouched, and it appears to have been flint knapped after it was heated again. So I speculate that it had to have been heat treated before it was flint knapped the first time, and then the tip and the piece that broke off of it had to have been heated again, or were reincorporated into the fire because they are heated to a greater degree than the base. That's all we can speculate. I don't know for sure if there was specifically how many times it was heat treated, but we can speculate based on the color and the technological aspects that it had been reheated at some point.
So based on, obviously, it's the color change and the level of color change that can help you determine how many times or how heat treated it was. Have you ever seen pieces where like the exterior had changed color, but the interior, like maybe it hadn't been heated long enough to change?
So that biface base is actually a good example of that. It's kind of red around the edges, and then the inside you can still see the blue-gray. And I mean, I think that's like, I think with a lot of this stuff, you're probably not going to see it unless it's a bigger fragment, because you're not going to break open the artifacts. But the exterior color changes based on the experimental work that we did. You can see the kind of like changes that are going on over a longer duration. And so you get like these kind of like rosy colors at first, but then once you get into kind of the milky, like there was that Plano or that late Paleo-Indian point that I showed that was very speckled. That's the result of like fairly substantial heat treating, is that it's lost its translucency. In the heat treating experiments that I did, at a certain point, it turns into what looks like chalk at a high enough temperature and for a long enough time period, basically. And so what it looks like is too that like not only were they heat treating, they were controlling the temperature of the fire to evenly heat treat stuff, right? Like there were a few pieces that were clearly burnt and were kind of like crackled and crazed and whitish, but for the vast majority of it, it looked like it was probably fairly consistently heated, and they were keeping the temperature like it would have been quite a task to keep the temperature of the fire relatively even. And so, you know, it's possible that they were using like an earth oven, which is like how a lot of the experimental, like if you're putting in like a sand bath is kind of how they visualize or how they've experimentally shown. So objects are buried below a hearth and covered with sand, and then the fire's built on top of it. So the objects kind of bake in an oven and they don't get exposed to the heat, so it doesn't flash super hot. But we don't know that for sure at the Millbrook site. In part, I mean, the possibility is that they dug into the hearth to take the objects out, and so it doesn't have that perfect profile anymore. But there are sites like there's a site up here in Ontario. Chris Ellis has an image of the profile where they found artifacts in one of these like sand baths, basically, right? Like it was, you know, like a stack of bifaces at the bottom of a hearth. So that's pretty rare, but you can find that, I guess.
So clearly intentional.
Yes, yeah, in that case, and I think I'd be very confident in saying that they were intentionally heat treating stuff at Millbrook as well.
We have a question from Wesley. Could varying hammer techniques in the archaeological record be responsible for the lack of a statistically significant increase in flake length or usability after heat treating?
That is entirely possible. And my experimental attempts at this were really bad because I'm a terrible flint knapper. So I could not demonstrate with the experimentally heated stuff whether or not you know, it improved in knappability, just because for me it's like you know, I wouldn't be the person to do that. So you know, like Cliff Shaw was really interested in us continuing to do some of these mechanical experiments with the geological specimens that we had. And, you know, while we were doing the review, going through some of the final edits for this paper, he had made a few comments on it that, you know, were great, but they were basically like, that's a whole new project. And that's something that maybe we do down the road. And so, you know, like one of the things that we've talked about is doing these fracture toughness assessments, basically seeing whether or not you can demonstrate that the rock is easier to break in sort of an objective way. But certainly different types of percussor would definitely make a difference, right? You know, if you're pressure flaking it or you're using antler or using hard hammer or something like that, it's all going to change the way that it breaks. So Sue?
Yeah, and I think this is this area of the intersection between preference and the decision making that's going into knapping and the actual execution of the work is an area that I think we need to think a lot about. I think there's all sorts of implications. I mean, our primary point is to broaden the way we're thinking about this and to broaden the range of factors that are informing people's decision making around stone tool production. But an example of this would be, you know, if color is a primary factor in decision making at various stages, we should be thinking about how that manifests itself at all stages of the production sequence. So for example, at the quarry, you may find people are napping away unwanted colors, and so there should be more debris of unwanted colors, right? So early stages, you may find, if you look at it from a technological point of view and distinguish between different stages of reduction, if you have a big enough assemblage to do it, you might see that there's early stage debris that's set aside that may have nappable material in that volume but isn't napped, those kinds of things. So there's a way in which this allows us to look at this material with a new way of looking at it. Now that said, we have to continue to do that, and I think that sort of is the next step, is to try and apply this kind of thing to lithic technology and those kinds of operational sequences in the production of tools in a broad way.
This is how PhD projects get out of hand.
Yes.
I have another question from Carol. Can living Indigenous groups in the Maritimes shed much light on the meaning of the different colors?
Yes, so a lot of our interpretations are informed by Indigenous community members, right? We have a colleague who's an Indigenous archaeologist who we've drawn on her expertise and her advice. The thinking about like sweat lodges as incorporating it in there, that came from a conversation between Sue and Ramona, for example, right? I think one of the, as Sue was saying, expanding our thinking around lithic technology and how we think about these processes, at some point, the project needs to shift to engaging community members and talking about their perspectives on stone and that kind of thing, and bringing it into, trying to integrate a broader community perspective on, even things like reduction sequences and how stone is manipulated. There are community members who are flint knappers who probably be interested in taking part in stuff like this. And I've spoken to friends of mine who, I've in back of my mind, I've got I think a great project would be to do like a canoe build or something with Washtenaw Church, for example. Like that would be kind of a fascinating thing and talk about the process basically, right? And all the stuff that's going into it.
Yeah, and I think when I first started becoming interested in color many years ago, it was because of working with people like Elder Gwen Blair. And when we first started doing this work, I was interested in actually collaborating with her on the research and co-authoring with her, but she was less interested in that, and she unfortunately passed away and no longer continue to be a part of the research. But I think that's got to be how we understand this kind of material, is through collaboration and opening doors for Indigenous people to kind of explore what they feel this might mean.
Absolutely. I'll take one final question from Terry. Would there be evidence from other sites where heat treatment was used in point manufacture, yet the material did not have any obvious change in appearance?
As in like whether or not there's heat treated stuff that we can't see because the color hasn't changed? Was that the question? I'm assuming,
or maybe like any obvious change. So just like I could think of maybe like a Bois Blanc formation chert that's, even when burnt, sort of stays that same light.
Yeah, so your best indicators are the color, and then technologically there's that like the luster, right? So on actually a good example would be like Onondaga Church doesn't change a whole lot when it's heat treated. And there's a site that the U of T has as a collection from Fort Erie. And there's a lot of heat treated material. A lot of the Genesee points are heat treated. And the flake scars basically are very glossy on a lot of the, and it's not polished because like a lot of the arises are still very sharp, but it appears to be a lot of the stuff is heat treated. And there's a lot of stuff that has like potlits, for example, right? So potlit fractures result from heat alteration, not necessarily intentional heat treatment, because potlits can mean that it was heated up very quickly and it fractures. It's basically like a shock fracture. But yeah, intentional heat treating, the best things are these color changes, and then looking for these lustrous surfaces that would have been that an object was heated and then subsequently napped. If it was fully flint knapped and then heat treated and it hasn't changed the color of it, there's very little that you'd be able to tell, I think, without looking at it maybe under like a scanning microscope. You can see visual changes on the stone.
I think, okay, Terry says the point of the question is to try to have a way of evaluating whether it was done for technical or non-technical purposes.
Yeah, so I lucked out with the assemblage I had in that, you know, we had sort of a full range of like a whole production sequence, including like a finished biface, and we had a hearth and so and a quarry that was close by, like that kind of thing. So you know, in this case, we were able to, with a small assemblage, look at everything and be able to like come up with this. In a single object, I think it'd be really hard to say. I mean, the context would be really important. Like if you found it at the base of a hearth and you think it might be heat treated and it's like a finished biface, then you can probably, it was probably placed there intentionally. But if it's just picked up off the surface and you think it might be heat treated, it's, you know, it's hard to say. You wouldn't know if it was intentional or if it was a technical decision or an aesthetics decision.
Right. I think that's good clarification on Terry's question. And I think that's a really good place to stop. Ken or Susan, anything that you want to add before we say goodbye?
Thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about stuff we love.
Oh,
yeah, this was great. Thank you guys. And thank you all for coming. You were a great audience, and you can hear the kids are scratching at the door here.
Ready to go to bed. Well, I won't keep you then. Thank you both for your work and for your presentation. It was great to have you be able to join us despite COVID. It's nice to be able to bring people in from other provinces and areas to speak. For the membership, I hope to see you all at the next AGM or the next lecture, which will be our AGM as well. Hopefully we have an announcement on who will be speaking soon. And I just want to thank you again, Ken. It was a wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate you taking your time.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Mikhail and Sarah, for inviting us, and hope to see you guys again in the next season.
Absolutely. Have a good evening, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you next month.
Yep.